Ancient Faith Radio brings you The Law of the Spirit with Father Maxime Lesac, practical and theological teaching on the spiritual life. Father Maxime is the priest at Christ the Savior Orthodox Church in Ottawa, Ontario.
When we were last together, we spoke about the soul and the heart and the mind. And this evening I wanted to speak to you about three aspects of the soul, three powers of the soul. And I'll use first of all the terms in Greek. They are nous, logos, and pneuma. Nous, which is usually translated as intellect, but we're going to speak more about it this evening. And we're going to demonstrate that in fact, English has no good translation for the word nous. Logos can be fairly easily translated as word, although in Greek it can also refer to intelligence. And pneuma is very well translated by the word spirit in English. So in speaking of the three powers of the soul, I have used this evening what is a kind of a standard approach in the Fathers. Certainly this is the approach of St. Gregory Palamas. I'm not saying that all of the Fathers of the Church used exactly this model in speaking of the powers of the soul. And so you're going to see a little bit of variety in the terminology of the Fathers, which is perfectly fine. They are saying the same thing essentially, but they are sometimes using terminology in a slightly different way. All of them, of course, speak of the inner person and of the powers of the soul. So let's speak first of all about the nous, the one that last time I said could be translated by either mind or intellect. I think we'll see this evening that we need to generate a new word in English perhaps as a translation for it, or at least qualify all of the translations that we have. The Fathers of the Church refer to the nous as the eye of the soul, or sometimes as the purest aspect of the soul. The soul's faculty of spiritual awareness. It's that aspect of the soul that allows the soul to have a direct, unmediated experience of God, which is really something quite fantastic when you think of it, that the human person has that capacity. Every person has the capacity to have a direct, unmediated experience of God. And that is quite something because we are created and God is uncreated. And so normally you might not have expected that we would have such an innate capacity to have a direct, unmediated experience of God, but we do. And this is part of the image of God that was granted to humanity as a gift. In the Fathers of the Church, the nous is very much associated with the heart. Sometimes they're used virtually synonymously, virtually. And so the expression noetic activity is sometimes translated in English as prayer of the heart. The nous, in order to function well, needs to keep its connection with the heart. It needs to remain a function of the heart and not be replaced by any other function or power of the soul. I'm going to explain this in greater detail in a few minutes. The nous receives impressions and information from the senses. It should not be equated with the senses. And this aspect of the soul, so intimately connected with the heart, was deeply affected by the fall, by the advent of death and sin into the world. And I'm going to mention just 4 ways, there are more, 4 ways in which the nous was affected by the fall. First of all, the fall caused the nous to be darkened. Secondly, and I'll go back to these, it caused it to be diffuse. Thirdly, it caused it to be weakened and sometimes replaced. Fourthly, and you may find the way I phrased this curious, the fall caused the nous to seek religion instead of a personal God revealed in Trinity. The nous needs to be illumined, but it cannot be illumined without the purification of the heart. This is why these 2 things are so much connected in patristic literature, in the writings of the fathers of the Church. We speak, first of all, when speaking about the spiritual stages through which a person passes in the Christian life, we speak first of the purification of the heart and then the illumination of the nous, or the intellect. That is because there is no such thing as an illumined nous with a heart that has not been purified. And the nous is illumined in part through obedience to Christ's commandments. This is how the heart is purified, when we obey the Lord's commandments out of love. And through the rejection of sinful and passionate thoughts. The nous in sinful people is weakened and almost dead. Sometimes I refer to it as lost, the lost nous. Not the obliterated nous, but the lost nous. And when it's weakened or lost or almost dead, it seeks out this aspect of the soul, power of the soul, seeks out various experiences, but not necessarily a personal God. When you look back, well, at least some of us can look back to the 1960s. If you can't look back to it yourself, you can look back to it perhaps by reading about it. You see that it was the time of great experimentation. People were seeking for different experiences, trying to get, at its best, a deeper appreciation of reality. At its worst, other things. And this experimentation of the 1960s and the obsession with phenomena that we still have now in our own time shows us that a weakened nous is also a nous which is diffuse. By that, I mean that instead of staying where it ought to, which is in the context of the heart, a darkened nous leaves the place where it ought to be and seeks out other experiences which it is not competent to handle. In other words, to put it in very simple language, the heart opens itself up to things which not only don't heal it, but hurt it further. I think you can put it in language that simple. If we use nous and heart almost synonymously, then we can put it this way. Indeed, when the nous is weakened, it is replaced by other powers of the soul, principally by the rational powers of the soul. And we'll speak in a moment about why that's not always, or why that it is not, in fact, a good thing. And then the remark I made about The nous, when it's darkened or weakened, seeks after religion instead of seeking a personal God revealed in Trinity. It seeks after phenomena, it seeks after experiences. You can see that people who have been not taught the Christian faith are very, very hungry and tend to get into all kinds of different areas, pseudo-religious areas, which ultimately are not very helpful for them. And that's precisely because the nous, or spiritual intellect, is not functioning properly, or perhaps hardly functioning at all. So it can be replaced or suppressed by the rational faculty or the rational powers in the human person, and this creates an imbalance in the human person. This part needs to be healed. It's a pathology that needs to be identified and treated and healed. Now, to speak about the logos, the word, another power of the soul. This is the aspect of the inner person, of the soul, that gives the nous, the spiritual intellect, the power of expression and articulation. The nous perceives, and the logos sets in order and articulates. We can distinguish here, when we're speaking about logos, between the power of expression and the rational power, although they are very closely connected. So when you're reading Fathers of the Church, you're going to see, and sometimes they'll use the word logos, and they will tie it to the part which is more connected, or the aspect of articulation, and sometimes they'll tie logos more with the rational part, and if that's the case, they'll often use the word logistikon, not just logos, but logistikon. And this is the intellectual or rational aspect of the soul. They are, in fact, not exactly the same thing, because the logos is there to give a voice to the nous. The nous sees, perceives, and intuits, and the logos gives it a voice, articulates, expresses, which is not exactly the same as the cognitive faculty the way we more often than not understand it today. And so if you look at the Fathers of the Church, when you're coming across, this is why I was apprehensive actually to do this presentation, because it can be a little bit confusing. Sometimes logos can refer to the rational or intellectual part or aspect, and sometimes to the part which is more connected with articulation. But they, in fact, distinguish between the two. So the nous was created, or rather, the logos was created to give the nous a voice. That's my language, to make it a little bit more simple. It needs, however, the logos, to give a voice to what the nous perceives, and not to act independently. Because when the logos, the power of articulation, or the power, the rational power, acts independently from the nous, from the heart, it can try to prove or disprove the existence of God on a purely rational basis without any reference to actual experience. So here I'm not saying that we can't engage rational discourse to talk about the existence of God, but that we can't prove the existence of God this way. The only way to so-called prove, if that's the right term in this case, in fact it's not, is to experience God. And that's what the nous in the heart can do, and does well when it's illumined, and when the heart is purified. Otherwise, the nous is suppressed. It becomes an aspect or power of the soul that loses its proper place, loses its power. It's immediately replaced by something else, and it's replaced by the intellectual or rational side. So actually, that is exactly what we see now. We see that in our own society. We see that in the way we learn. We see that, unfortunately, in the way we educate. This is something that needs to be corrected because, in fact, what we are often teaching our children to do is to disengage from the heart. To disengage. To allow the nous to be silenced and powerless. And to bring something in its place which had another role. We're going to see in a moment exactly what the role of the intellectual or rational side was to be. And we should know that every good book in Orthodox dogmatic theology does not start with proofs for the existence of God. You can see this. We have never started from this place because it is starting from a place that does not reflect wholeness of the inner person. When you start from this, you are already encouraging, in a sense, the lack of functionality in a human person. You're putting the emphasis on essentially what we would refer to as a kind of an imbalance or a pathology that occurs in the human person. It's not the way we want to be. But when you encourage people to do that, we normalize what in fact the fathers of the church consider an illness. And we should be very much aware of that tendency. We're not immune to it in the Orthodox Church, because when other people engage us that way, we tend to want to respond in exactly the same way. And we've got to be very much aware of this. A sick logos is a symptom of a sick or a lost nous. Here's the way I express it. These are my words. A sick logos is capable of unintelligent intelligence. A sick logos is capable of unintelligent intelligence. It has intelligence, but disconnected from the nous, it's not intelligent intelligence. It's unintelligent intelligence. And disconnected from the heart and from the nous, it becomes immediately susceptible to arrogance. And I don't think I need to elaborate on that point for you. It cannot be cured, the logos, without the illumination of the nous and the purification of the heart. I will speak for a moment about the spirit, pneuma. The spirit, or pneuma, as an aspect or power of the soul, is not so much a separate part as much as the grace of God that permeates every aspect of the inner person. The grace of God that permeates every aspect of the human person. It gives vitality to everything. Even when I say it, it's less than accurate because, of course, the grace of God has a personal connection. The grace of God is uncreated, and because it refers back to his person, grace is not an it. But if I called grace a he in English, it would sound strange. So I'm using the word it, but I just want to qualify my use of the word it. It gives vitality to all the other aspects of the human person. It demonstrates that we have the image of God as an innate aspect of humanity. It does not work against the will of the person. Pneuma, or spirit, is often used as a synonym for nous. In fact, in Holy Scripture, when St. Paul is using the word pneuma and referring to the human person, more often than not, or in his use of it, it is actually not so much the grace of God, so much as quite simply the heart or the nous. It's a reference to the enduring and deepest aspect of the human person. St. Paul doesn't mean, again, to make the spirit a separate part of the human person, but is simply referring to the deepest aspect. So for me, I find it helpful to see that spirit in St. Paul is what the fathers who come after him mean when they say nous. And that ties the two together, Scripture and the fathers. Again, here's an example of their saying the same thing, but having a certain preference for particular lexicon, for choice of language. Now, I realize that what I've said could be just a little bit confusing, and that is why I'm a little bit concerned about saying the next thing I'm about to say, but I'll try to draw it all together at the end. There's another way in the Fathers of understanding the inner person when you are discussing the powers of the soul. Some Fathers take the following approach. They talk about the intelligent aspect, logos or logistikon. Then they talk about what I will translate as the desiring aspect, epithemitikon in Greek, and another aspect, themikon, of forceful feelings and emotions. These are sometimes called in the patristic literature, the desiring aspect, appetitive, and the aspect or powers that are connected with strong feelings and emotions, irascible. But when you use that kind of terminology, I fear that you lose people quickly. So I've called it the desiring aspect and the aspect connected with forceful feelings and emotions. Here's what we need to say about all three aspects. We've discussed the logos in some detail already. So let's speak about the other two aspects. The desiring aspect, or powers of the soul, and the powers of the soul connected to forceful feelings and emotions. They are God-given. God set this in the human person for a reason. We don't want to take those aspects and stamp them out or remove them. Instead, we want to see them transformed. Without the desiring aspect, we would not desire holiness. We would not have desire of any type. However wounded and deformed by sin, those same powers of the soul can manifest themselves as jealousy, lust, and many other related passions. Forceful feelings and emotions are God-given. We need them. Without them, we would have no revulsion for sin. We would not be repelled by it. That is a forceful emotion. And yet, wounded and distorted, the themikon becomes destructive and self-centered anger, one that seeks the suppression or destruction or exploitation of the other person. All three aspects, logos, the desiring aspect, and the aspect or powers associated with forceful feelings and emotions are, as I mentioned, a God-given. They are all three susceptible to the passions, and the latter two most especially. Beginners in the spiritual life are thus well advised to simply cut the passions off when they express themselves. And here, for example, if we talk about anger, yes, it is possible to be angry and not to sin. We see this in the life of the Lord when he is expelling the vendors and the money changers from the temple. You can't get away from the fact that he is angry. He's not negotiating with them. He's turning over their tables. He's formed a whip to push them out. What other word could you give for it other than he's angry with them? But he's not sinning. It is a prophetic anger. When was the last time that you and I had an expression of anger that was 100% prophetic and had no self-pity, was not self-centered? Well, was there ever a time that we had anger that was not self-centered and didn't have a certain amount of violence in it or self-pity? So we're well advised, especially at the beginning, simply to cut off these passions so that they don't do damage to ourselves and to others. But the reality is that they need to be rehabilitated and not suppressed. Because the suppression of all of these powers of the soul, even the ones that have gone wrong, if you suppress them entirely, it gives way to other illnesses and even other kinds of passions. And so when we are talking about the passions, we should not be thinking about cutting them off and suppressing them or obliterating them. We should think in terms of their transformation. The transformation leads to a balanced, healthy human person who has logos or logistikon, who has strong desire, and who can also have forceful emotions, which is to say they are not emotionally flat. A healthy person is not emotionally flat. And that's what happens if you take these powers and simply obliterate them. In their original form, they are what certain fathers of the church would call natural energies. They are God-given. In that form, they are not distorted. They are allowing us to be full and healthy human persons. But natural energies become passions when they are twisted and they are self-centered. When we are wounded by sin, that is part of the soul that is profoundly affected, and the natural energies don't express themselves as natural energies anymore. They express themselves as passions. When we are very, very young, we learn the wrong use of the desiring and forceful powers of the soul through a wrong use of those powers in others. It's so difficult for parents to reflect on the fact that we have passed on this wrong information to our own children. And they have come to a point of thinking that these powers are to be used in the wrong way. And so we learn the wrong use of the desiring and forceful powers through a wrong use of the powers by others, and also because of sin in general that has an impact on the human person. The passions need to be redirected. They need to be schooled through obedience to the commandments, but they also need to be denied. When they are denied, they slowly wither, revealing the original natural energies which can be transformed and which can be channeled into real virtues. Virtues, therefore, do not appear without the grace of God and without self-denial. The grace of God becomes especially available to us in the sacraments and through prayer and asceticism, and that is what we're going to talk about the next time that we are together.
And that was Father Maxime Lesac with The Law of the Spirit, a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.